All right, good evening, gentlemen. Good evening, gentlemen, good evening. We are in the middle of a long discourse, as is his custom, of the Rebbe Rashab. We started speaking about Hanukkah. We started learning this discourse before Hanukkah. We're still going, which is good. It's very healthy. In general, it says we learn in Chassidus that a tzaddik, their avodas Hashem, because the tzaddik is lacking in transgression, he's lacking in setbacks. He doesn't do things that are detrimental to his service of Hashem. Therefore, he's ready to attach to each thing exactly as it comes up. When it's Lag BaOmer, he's ready for Lag BaOmer. When it's Pesach, he's ready for Pesach. When it's Purim, he's ready for Purim. The Baal Tshuva, on the other hand, people who sometimes do things that are detrimental, so they get behind. It's like getting held back in school, right? And in general, the Baal Tshuva, he knows that the calendar is very holy, and he might be less holy, so it's okay if he's still learning a Chanukah Maimer by Pesach, in general. Right, he has things that he has to do for himself. He fell off the schedule. He's not on the schedule. We're doing our own catch-up job. Maybe by next Hanukkah we'll be back on the schedule. Anyway, tonight we're going to discuss something a little sensitive, a little, tantalizing. Maybe we should have advertised the class more. We could have put up billboards. Tonight we're going to discuss the question, really we've discussed it in this class before, but we're going to discuss once again the question of, does God exist? That's what we're going to discuss in tonight's class. We talk a lot about God in this class without ever talking about whether he exists, so I felt it was time we finally, get down to brass tacks and discuss whether, what do you mean? Whether he's, no, there's not going to be a vote. That's not how it's going to work. Jews always vote not to mix in anyway, right? It's the famous jury, the famous story about the Jewish jury is that they voted, They voted 9-3 not to mix in, not to get involved, right? That was their decision. Anyway, why are we talking about whether God exists? Because we've gone so far in our discourse that we are now at a low enough place. We're going down in our discourse. We're talking about lower and lower things. We're in a low enough place to finally discuss whether God exists. Our discourse began, we have a discourse about Achdus Hashem, the unity of God in the world. Our discourse began, what we've been speaking about until now for weeks and weeks. People must feel free to go and review the past classes, etc. We've been discussing for weeks and weeks how God has not changed. Nothing has changed since before the universe was created. The creation of all of this, the bringing into being of something other than God, poses no change to God whatsoever. Despite all appearances, everything is exactly as it was before. Right? Nothing has changed. And we divided this problem up into three parts, as you may recall. I'm not going to go into the whole thing again. We've reviewed it probably 4 or 5 weeks in a row, I think, a solid review of the whole topic again. So this week, we're going to get back to all of that maybe in a little bit, in a few more weeks. But for this class, I would prefer not to review the whole thing. So I'm going to say very, very briefly, we've divided the problem into three parts. There's God himself, so to speak, the infinite. There's God as he hides himself and conceals himself and limits himself in order to create, or God in the process of speaking, as we've called him in some previous classes. And then there is the creation, the result of the act of creation. So far we've spoken about the first two of these. And what we've said very basically and very briefly is that because God's changing, so to speak, the thing that is being changed is of God himself. In other words, there is no new reality that does not come from God himself. There is no concealment that is not as godly as the revelation that existed previously. Therefore, nothing really has changed, because whatever God is hiding himself with, whatever God is hiding behind, whatever God is using to put distance between himself and a certain reality, all of that is just further godliness. There's nothing else with which to hide. There's nothing for him to hide behind. He's not hiding behind a tree, because nothing else other than him exists. All he can hide behind is his own hands, right? And as we discussed before, like the tortoise hiding in its shell, the tortoise is not really hidden because the shell is part of the tortoise. So too God in the act of concealing himself, of limiting himself, of entering into a process in order to create, none of that is a true concealment of God. God is as present in all of that as he was before. So to speak, the only thing that can change is that instead of his face being presented, his hands are presented, so to speak. All that's changed is the way that God is presenting himself, so to speak. But there is no actual concealment. There is no actual hiding. There is no actual change. God remains totally unchanged. Now the problem, as we come to Eis Beis, just last week we started the second chapter, the second part of our discourse. The problem is that there's the third category, which we haven't addressed yet, which is there's a creation. There's something other than Hashem. When you're talking about God himself, you're talking about God himself. When you're talking about a process he enters into to create, you're talking about manifestations of him, expressions of him, things that come out from him. But when you talk about a creation, when you talk about a nivra or an elam, when you talk about a world or a creation, what are you talking about? You're talking about what appears to be a radical change. Because before, God is alone. Nothing other than God exists. Okay, there's manifestations, the light of God, as we call it, so to speak. But that's not another thing. By definition, it's light. Everyone understands that the light that comes out from the bulb is at a totally different level of reality than the bulb. It's totally dependent on its source. It's not an independent thing, right? It's just something that comes forth from God, right? Constantly, so to speak. It's just an emanation. But when you get to a creation, when you get to something that is a yesh, it's not a nothing, it's a something, and it appears to be a something the way that God is a something. And now you appear to have a change, because before, when God was alone, there was nothing else that existed. Now, something else exists. Or as we started discussing last week, it's really a totally different mode. Reality goes from being what you might call univocal or monodirectional. Reality goes from being there's one thing and everything else that there is just an expression of that one thing. Now it appears to be bidirectional, right? Or bifocal. There's two foci. There's two points, right? Reality becomes a spectrum. There's God on one end, and then there is something else. So you could choose any creation, from a hydrogen atom to a frog to the Malach Gabriel. You could choose any creation you want, the angel Gabriel. You could choose any creation, or all of the creations together. It doesn't matter. You have God, and then you have some other self, some other being that is looking out at the universe. How is this not a change? This is our new topic of discussion. That's what we're discussing now. So that's the review in short. And we went a little bit into this chapter. We ended last week with a short discussion about bittul, right? About what it means, nullification, or bittul in Chassidus. And we explained that the key to the whole answer of why the creation is not a change is because the creations are all batul. The creations are all in a state of nullification. And we brought the example from halacha, like the drop of milk that falls into the pot of chicken soup, right? Where the milk is there, but halachically, in the eyes of the law, it has no reality of its own. You consider this whole thing to be chicken soup. right? That was our example we gave at the end of last class. If there's enough soup to milk, right? And only to eat b'diavad, only to eat after the fact. Don't go pouring milk in your soup. Anyway. Which brings us to the question of God's existence. Because as we are going to start explaining, and it's a long explanation, so it's going to take us some time, but hopefully we'll do it justice. And the nice thing is that a lot of this explanation you've heard before in this class, so people who have been in this class for a long time will find a lot of things that are familiar about this explanation. We're going to explain why everything is batel. We're going to explain the way in which the creation is nullified. It's not really here. That's the answer to why nothing has changed. Nothing has changed because all of the things that appear to be independent from Hashem, right, are not really here. They're not really there. They're batel. Their true reality is that they're nullified. They're not themselves. And so, nothing has changed. God is alone in a profound sense. God is alone in the sense that nothing else exists really. Nothing else really exists. Now what that means, right, we have to explore, because it's not so simple that it just doesn't exist. In Chassidus, we're much more complicated than that. We believe what the Torah says when the Torah says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. There are things that exist. God brought them into existence. What we're talking about is the nature of that existence. And we're going to explain that at length, so don't worry about that. This brings us to the question of God's existence. Why it brings us to the question of God's existence may take a class to explain. So let's explain it. Really, the question is not does God exist? The question is really what is God, is really the question. And the reason why that's a meaningful question is because there's different standards by which to answer the question, what is God? So let me give you an example, right? If you're a biologist, let's get even more specific, like if you're let's say you're a pulmonologist, right? When you look at a human being as a pulmonologist, the field of pulmonology, the study of lungs, right, the health of lungs, lung health. The pulmonologist, when he looks at a human being, right, he's mostly focused on the lungs, right? If you ask a pulmonologist, by pulmonology's standards, is this a good human being? He would say, yes, he's excellent, very healthy lungs. He never smoked, right? If you were asking in terms of morality, is he a good human being? It's a totally different question, right? A very simple example I'm giving you. Obviously, I'm not saying anything very profound, right? When you ask the question, what is God? Before you answer, you have to ask another question, which is very Jewish, of course. You have to ask, what do you mean? Who's asking, right? In other words, are you asking as a pulmonologist, what's God? If you understand what I'm saying, metaphorically speaking. What?
The answer is easier, because I mean, you look at the human body or any part of the universe, it's made out of parts. God is just one. He's one, and one is him. He's not made out of any parts.
One second, you're getting ahead of me. You're right, of course, but I'm not ready to fit that into the class yet. It depends what you mean. It depends what you mean when you say, what is God? So, we now have 3 questions in a row. We have the question, does God exist? In order to understand that, in order to answer that question, you have to ask, what is God? And in order to ask, what is God, you have to ask, who's asking? Right? What's the nature of that question? Let me explain it to you like this, right? Traditionally speaking, and by traditionally I mean, let's say, before 600 years ago, right? Recent, to the Jews, very recent history, 600 years ago, right? So to us, it's a blink of an eye, right? Before 600 years ago, it was not considered intellectually significant to prove that God exists. In other words, nowadays, the question of does God exist has a reputation in our society as a big question, a heavy question, a very question of tremendous significance, etc., etc., right? Intellectual significance, like, you have to go out and ask the great thinkers, and how do you know, etc., etc. You don't go around asking the great thinkers in all the different fields, and the great writers, and the great philosophers, and the great scientists. You don't go asking them, I don't know, does the number 4 exist? Right? It never comes up. And not just because God is meant to be the creator and the moral height of the universe, right? Whereas the number 4 is just a number. The reason for this discrepancy is because in modern times, in modern philosophy, the question of God's existence and the means by which he was always understood to be known to exist have been called into question. Now, we can't get into the whole philosophical back and forth about why it's been called into question and what changed 600 years ago and why did it become such a significant question. I want to focus on instead, because this is not a philosophy class, this is a Chassidus class, I want to focus instead on why before 600 years ago or thereabouts was it considered fairly simple. It was considered a child's thing, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, right, could appreciate intellectually the demonstration, the fact that God exists, right? It's very boring. The proofs are all very boring. They're not very exciting, right? I'll give you an example. I don't even need to give you an example. All the proofs of God's existence are basically the same. All the traditional, the old proofs, the proofs that God exists, right? And I use the proof in a very loose sense. I'm not a fan of the word proof in general, but the old demonstrations, the way you would explain, how do I know that God exists, right? It's very simple. Everything I see around me, everything I observe is contingent. Everything I see around me depends in some way, and there are many different ways you can go into this, and you could look at this in lots of different lenses. There's different ways you could look at it, but it all boils down to the same thing. Everything I see around me is contingent. Everything I see around me depends on something else to be what it is. For this thing to be what it is, it depends on something else, right? So then I go look on the thing that it depends on, and I see that it also depends on something else to be what it is, right? It takes extremely minor intellectual effort to realize that there can't be an infinite chain of things depending on other things, going back infinitely, because the thing would never get started, right? It's like saying that my mug sits on the table, which sits on the table's legs, which sits on the carpet, which sits on the floor, right? And you ask, well, what holds the floor up? And you say, oh, nothing. The floor just is on something else, which is on something else, which is on something else. And it's, as they say in philosophy or science, it's turtles all the way down, right? It's just another thing and another thing and another thing going infinitely, right? Doesn't make sense. Because how can the whole thing be standing? There has to be something at the bottom, right, which doesn't rest on anything else. And this something at the bottom, which doesn't rest on anything else, there must be a first thing which is not dependent on anything else. And that's what we call God. This is the traditional philosophical approach. Now, what do we mean when something is dependent, or all things are dependent? So there's all sorts of ways you could put it. You could talk about purpose, which is what philosophically is called teleology. You could talk about motion, which was what Aristotle used. That's why he called God the first mover, the one who doesn't move but moves other things, right? Because everything that's in motion, its motion has to be caused. There's different ways you could look at these things. There's which is not, by the way, which is said to be a violation of Newton's principle of inertia, but not necessarily. It's more complicated than that, but we'll save that for a non-Chassidus class. I don't know when we're going to learn one of those. Some say, look at it in a way of existence versus essence, right? Everything I see around me has a what it is and a that it is. What this is a mug. But there are some mugs, there's an idea of a mug that never exists. I can imagine a mug that never came into being. This mug is here. But what's interesting is that there's nothing about, what that means is there's nothing about being a mug that means that you have to exist. Right? Children understand this very intuitively, by the way. I think a lot of people, when they're small kids, at least for a moment, have this idea, right? That it's very strange that anything exists, right? There's nothing about this chair that says that this chair has to exist. There's the same idea of a chair, exactly the same idea that never existed. Right, it was the same, it would be the same color, it would be the same shape, the same everything, except that one happened to never exist. This one exists, right? From which you derive that everything around me must have something else that adds existence to what it is. Existence is an added ingredient to what it is. So then I have to go look at what gave this chair existence. But then when I look at whatever that is, I'll see that that also needs something else to add existence. So you have to go back until there's a bottom line thing where what it is that it is, right? By definition it exists. It exists necessarily. It exists because of what it is. And we call that thing God, right? All sorts of different, all sorts of different proofs like that. Our purpose here is not to get into these proofs. I'm mentioning this because it's important to understand just a little bit, right? Historically, contextually. And in case you think that I'm speaking to you about non-Judaism, God forbid, first of all, there are many Jewish philosophers who bring proofs just like this. Right? If you go learn the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam, or if you go learn the Svarim of Rav Sadia Gaon, or if you learn the Cheves Halavavos, or not the Kuzari is special. If you go learn Rav Chisdai Kreskas, if you go learn, I think Ibn Gavirol, there's all sorts of interesting things you can learn. They all talk about things like this. And the truth is that they too are not the originals, but if you go back to the Midrash, right, very interestingly, if you go back to the Midrashim, there's a whole series of fascinating midrashim about Avraham Avinu. How does Abraham discover God? Right? There's a whole bunch of midrashim. And if you go reading the midrashim, it speaks exactly about this, right? The rabbinic midrashim. So the early, if you want to say that they stretch back to only when they were written, so they go back to the Mishnaic period, right? Possibly when the Beis HaMikdash was still standing, right? You have in the midrash, you go and read, it talks about how did Avram discover God? He looked at the world, and he said it's like a tower with a candle burning in the window, right? And he said it can't be that this tower is here without a master, right? There must be someone who arranged and erected this tower and put up this tower, right? So he realized that there must be a God, right? Or if you go in the other midrashim, he talks about. First he thought the mountain was God, but then he thought the water washed away the mountain, so he thought that the water was God, but then he saw that the cloud was blown by the wind, so he thought that the wind was God, right? Something like that, so on and so on. It's the same ideas.
This is technical things.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Avraham Avinu.
Yeah.
And let's go back to old stuff. If you ever been in the desert.
If you what?
If you ever been in the desert.
Yeah.
In a camp.
Yeah.
In a tent. And contemplating the skies, looking down, it's empty.
I agree, but one second, Yossi, I'm going somewhere. I can't.
I need to go because let me just listen to this angle.
For how long?
A few seconds, but I need to tell it, otherwise it's pointless. Because the entire approach, the moment that Abraham Avinu discovered God, it was not with his intellect. Not that it's mean that he was not intellectual, he was very intellectual. Intellect is one thing that people have in those days, maybe more than ever, maybe more than today. But they discovered God by not using only the brain, the intellect of the brain, but he discovered something else that in the desert was able, is the shum.
I agree with you, but you're not letting me get there. Yossi, I agree with you. You're not letting me get there.
Just a second.
Why? No, let me get where I'm going. Yossi, please, let me go forward. Let me go forward. We'll see. You didn't let me finish. You're telling me where I'm going. You didn't even let me finish. Let me finish. You'll see where I'm
Let's
going.
go back at the end. If we are ready to see...
Yossi, don't worry. I got you, Yossi. I got you. Don't worry. Trust me a little bit. I got you. So, we're asking, does God exist? The question is who's asking? So, why do all of these philosophers, here's the point of why I'm bringing all of this up. Here's really what I'm talking about. Why do all of these philosophers, all of these questions, right? The philosopher looks at something in the world, right? A thinker, a philosopher, the word philosopher makes you uncomfortable. A thinking person looks at something in the world. They ask questions based on seichel, right? And they arrive at the fact that there must be a first existence, there must be a first cause, as the Rambam writes, a first existence that brings into being all the other existences, right? Why must God exist to a thinking person if the mind is what's asking, right? If we're asking we're asking who's asking the question, what is God, right? If the human intellect, looking at the world around it, is asking the question, what is God? God must exist. If God does not exist, nothing else exists. And since other things exist, I know that God must exist. So in other words, if the intellect is what's asking, we need God to exist. It's not a question of it would be nice for God to exist, right? It's a davar hapashut, as we say. It's a simple thing. If the intellect is asking, if the mind is asking, there must be, I need him as an explanation, right? Which in general you should just know, just by the way, this is a side point, but back in the day, in the over 600 years ago, the word cause and the word explanation were the same, right? If you need something to have caused this, that's a different way of saying I need something to explain it, right? In other words, let's take another step back. The original question was, does God exist, right? Then we said, what is God, right? If your answer to what is God is he's a being that must exist, right? For anything else to exist. He's a being that must be, right? Because in other words, the answer to the question, what is God, is he serves as the explanation, in some sense, for everything else that I see around me, right? Then the question, does God exist, isn't even a question. You understand what I'm saying? That's why more than 600 years ago this was not considered a very, this wasn't like a lofty intellectual question. This was the beginning, right? This wasn't differential equations or calculus. This was arithmetic, right? This is the beginning. If God is He's the missing puzzle piece. He's the puzzle piece I need to be able to explain the existence of everything else, right? That's what he is by definition. God, by definition, is that which I need to explain the existence of everything else in the world. Then the question, does he exist, is a self-answering question, right? What do you mean, does he exist? It's the basis of the existence of everything, right? It's like asking, does existence exist?
Then the question comes up.
No, 1 second. Not ready for you yet, Yossi.
That's what it is.
Does existence exist, right? The question answers itself. It's not really a question, right? That's why it matters who's asking. If you're asking like an intellect from over 600 years ago, then the question, what is God, is the puzzle piece that explains the existence of everything else. And the question, does he exist, is self-answering. Of course he exists, right? Not a significant question. What do you call it? A trivial question, right? A question that's not. It's a question. It's almost like a tautology. It's like, does existence exist? Is a square, right? However, the need for God to exist, as you'll notice in this whole explanation, the need for him to exist is if he is serving as the intellectual explanation for everything else's existence. Again, the need for him to exist. Why do I, a human being thinking, need him to exist? Because in order for my thinking to work, in order for my puzzle to be complete, right, there has to be this thing called God. In other words, and I think Yossi would agree with me profoundly on this point, in other words, what we are describing in all of this proof and all of this demonstration is not God himself. We are describing God as he is needed for my mind to explain the world. Again, what we are describing, what we have captured, what we have seized on, is not God himself. It's God as he is necessary, as he is sufficient to explain the world around me and the existence of the things around me. In other words, I'll summarize this whole thing in just one sentence. Philosophy approaches God from the bottom up. We start with the existence of the world around us. We arrive at God because the picture of the world as we perceive it is not finished. Right? The things around us there's a side that's empty. There's an aspect which is left open. Everything around us is contingent. It's not fully real. It's dependent. So we need to put something at the top that's independent, right? That doesn't depend on anything. And so we call that God, right? However, if we break free from this need, in other words, if we as human beings do not approach with the need to explain the puzzle first, if we don't approach with, I need to explain the world around me as the first priority, but rather we approach knowing God as the first priority, the need to say that God exists is obviated. The importance of saying that he exists, what depends on saying that he exists, right? If you approach from the world first and trying to understand God intellectually from the world around you, right, then what depends on God is quite a lot. It's my whole mind. If we take away God, everything else crumbles. My whole understanding crumbles. I have no way of understanding the world. Really, this is what happened in the last 600 years. In the last 600 years, we've made attempts to understand the world without God, understanding it in a different way where it doesn't rely on him. The success of those attempts is for a different, again, for a non-Chassidus class. Whether that succeeds or not, I don't know. But it's interesting that if you take away that need to explain the whole puzzle, to explain the world around you, if your first priority is not explanation and understanding everything that you see, but if your first priority is to find God, you actually do not need a God that exists. What do I mean by that? Not that you can be an atheist. That's not what I mean. 1 second. Not that you should be an atheist. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that your God does not have to be defined and limited by existence. Right? In other words, let's put it like this. And really this idea is found already in the Rambam. So it's actually found in the works of the philosophers. But whether it is a philosophical point itself is a matter of debate, because the Rambam wears many hats. The Rambam is not just a philosopher. In fact, he's not even primarily a philosopher. He's mostly a rabbi and a tzaddik and etc., etc. I heard once a story that Rav Zusha Anapoli, heard of him? Very famous Chassidic rabbi, right? With his brother Rabbi Elimelech, right? Rav Zusha Anapoli came to ask the Maggid of Mezrich, his Rebbe, a favor. He wanted a bracha. What was the blessing that Rav Zusha Anapoli asks for? When you're Zusha Anapoli, what's the blessing that you ask for? He wanted to feel the Rambam's Yiras Shamayim. He wanted to experience the Rambam's fear of heaven. And the story goes that the Maggid agreed, and he gave him a blessing. He should feel the Rambam's fear of heaven. And he was wrapped up in a little ball crying under a table, right? in fear, in terror, until he begged the Maggid of Mezrich to take it away, and the Maggid of Mezrich took it away. It was too much, it was overwhelming for him. And the Maggid of Mezrich told him that this was the Rambam's fear of God when he was in the middle of operating on his non-Jewish patients. Right? Not when he was davening on Yom Kippur, right? It was when he was in the middle of surgery, in the middle of the workday, right? That was the Rambam's. What? Because if he was operating on a Jew, obviously there's a whole different level, right? There's a whole different level in halacha. There's a whole different level in Aveda, right? So in other words, the fear of God that he had in the middle of the workday, not when he was dealing with members of his kehillah, people that he knew from his synagogue, when he was operating on regular, non-Jewish patients. In other words, the most workday of the workday, his fear of heaven was more than Rav Zusha and Anapoli could withstand. That's the story. So anyway, the Rambam, the philosopher, right? The philosopher said that he says like this. And really, the following is actually, it's kind of based in philosophy, that's the incredible thing, right? If you go back to what we were saying before, right? What's the proof that God exists, right? And now you understand why the word proof is not even such a great word, because proof is just describing how certain things relate in that puzzle of the intellect, in the system of logic where everything has to fit together, right? So the word proof has a much more powerful connotation than what it actually is, which is just making things fit together.
It's a primitive expression of what we want from God.
Correct, exactly, very well said. So,
That's what it is.
I agree.
How
So,
primitive we are, we still expecting it.
mamash,
And selfish also.
I agree with you.
By asking Mashiach to come. We are not ready for that. We're still primitive.
Mashiach will come and Mashiach will come in. Mashiach should come and he'll explain himself. He'll explain himself why he came even to people who are so coarse and lowly such as us. But yes, I agree with you in principle. So, if you look at what we said, where we said, everything else that I find is contingent, is dependent on something else, right? Everything else is dependent. So there must be something independent that gets the whole series going, and that thing is called God, right? The Rebbe writes in a Sikha, by the way, very beautifully, I just saw it recently in Likutei Sichos, that the Rebbe says that only Hashem you could call Das. Das in Yiddish is this, Zeh, right? Only Hashem you could really call Zeh. Because there's a couple reasons, but one of the reasons why is because nothing else is what it is. Only Hashem is Zeh. Only Hashem actually is what He is. Everything else is dependent, right? This mug is not what it is. It depends on other things for it to exist. So it's not really what it is. It's those other things too, right? And if you go find those other things, they also depend, right? Only God you could actually really, with an MS and truth called Zeh, called this. Only He is actually what He is. Anyway, so same idea, right? So when you look at this relationship where we said everything I find is dependent, everything else is contingent, is the better philosophical word. Everything else depends on something outside of it, so there must be an independent reality called God, right? So the Rambam says like this. The Rambam says an incredible thing in Mer Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed. The Rambam says, if everything that we know, right? If everything that we encounter that's available to our experience is contingent, right? Depends on something else. And the God that we need to explain them is not contingent, is necessary, is independent. He doesn't depend on anything else. Then why do we even think that we can say that God exists? Right? Really, it's not just exists, it's any description of God, any word, right? Any word you would use to describe God. He uses exists because it's the most baseline of all words, right? In order to get to the other words like, is blue or rides on a donkey, right? Or is 80 feet tall, before you get to any of those descriptions, you have to say the thing exists. That comes first, right? So the Rambam says the most basic thing you could say about a thing is exists, right? It is. Right? It be, as we say in good English, right? The thing be. So, you can't say that God exists. Why? It's very simple. It's very simple. Everything that you say that exists is depends on something else to exist, right? The Rambam says this in a much more philosophical way. I'm simplifying, but this is the bottom line. Everything that you know depends on something else to exist. God, we know from our proof, we know from our philosophy, from our thinking, God must not depend on something else. That's why we need him. That's what he is by definition. He doesn't depend on something else. But if everything that we know, right, exists in one way, and whatever he is in a categorically different way, a way that we've never encountered. We've never encountered in our whole lives something that is independent, right? We wouldn't even know what it looked like. We wouldn't even know what such a thing is like. We have no conception of it, right? You can't compare. It's not like, I've eaten fish before, so I know what this fish tastes like. You never experienced something that was independent. You don't know what something like that is like. So the Rambam says, how can you even apply the same word exists? God doesn't exist. To say that he exists actually means that he's not God, right? Because if he exists, that means he exists like everything else we say exists. And everything else is contingent, is dependent on something else. And if it's dependent on something else, it's not God. So you can't even say that God exists. That's why the Rambam says God is not a metzius, he's not an existence, he's a metzius, bilti metzius nimtza, which is very hard to translate. He is a existence without an existing existence. Would be the translation. Which means that even though all existences come from him and depend on him, nevertheless, what he is, we don't know what he is. We only know what he's not, right? He's not non-existent. So you can't say he's loy nimtza or bilti metzius. You can't say he doesn't exist. Right? But to say that he exists implies that he shares existence with everything else, which is not true. We've just proved that by definition, he is not like anything else. He's unique, right? He's one of a kind. So how can you say that he exists?
I heard something very nice. It's like an explanation, or giving the ways why God exists. So one cannot create himself.
Yeah.
He has to exist before he himself was created. That means, if you go to the first person, first made, it was obviously made by something else. Now, as I said, one cannot create, even the universe, the one who created the universe cannot be part of the universe, because then it would create itself. So
right.
The one who created the universe, and I'm talking about all the universe, or the universes, has to be external to that. Now, that's like one thing. The other thing, there cannot be another one. It can only be one. Because if there was another one, that means there was one before him, and then he's not alone. That means there's only one God, and he created everything. But now there's a big question. The other question is, and this is some of the other religious are saying, that okay, so God did exist. How can you prove that he still exists as of today? Because he created everything. You look at the mouth, you look at everything. If you not go with the assumption that everything is being created like every single moment, you can say that everything was created, and it is because it was created once.
Yeah.
So what's the answer to this one?
That's very good. We'll continue to discuss that. So what you're describing is a slightly different argument for the existence of God, which is known by its Islamic name as the kalam. But don't let that put you off too much, because the kalam or kalam, my Arabic accent is probably very bad. But the Rambam talks about this at length. The Rambam is not a fan of the kalam for whatever reason, but that's okay, because 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and Rav Sajagon is a fan of the kalam, and you can find it in the Chavis Halavaves. This is the argument for God's existence as a creator within time, chronologically, right? A thing can't create itself, so therefore, right? Slightly different than what we've been discussing, but still in the same genre, though. Not so different that what we're saying now generally doesn't apply to it. Sorry, thank you for bringing it up, Ayos. It's a different way of proving that Hashem exists. Very good, though. And as for your final question, we'll get to that. Not yet, though. We'll get to his constant involvement.
To quote a small quote from the rabbis.
Yeah.
Rabbi Sichas Ladai, like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
He said very, very simplified, very beautiful quote. How are we going to accept Mashiach, to understand God? we need to be like Moses after Matan Torah when he came down to the mountain with the tablets.
Yeah.
Because when he came down with the tablets, the aura, what happened to him, that the half of his body was in earth,
Yeah.
and the other half of the body was with God.
Yeah.
In the moment that we cannot navigate like Moses,
Yeah.
the halfway that we are connected to the ground, half of us are connected to the ground, and half of us is connected to the wells of the divineness, that's Piat Mashiach.
That's
Equivalent to Matan Torah.
We're working on it, Yossi.
And for what to reach at that point, we need to be a little bit close to Moses to understand the connection that we have here and have connected. That's how we navigate our life.
We're working on it.
That's
We're working
how
on it.
people need to. That's what we understand about God, and then we're not to be complicated, but we need to be not selfish. We ask for the Mashiach. We ask for this and proof. How can you come? Who's asking? How can you?
I see the connection.
How can you be Mashiach and come as God if after in the way that we are, after 1 month, we're going to start making jokes about God, about Mashiach?
Versteht sich. I understand the connection now. What Yossi is saying is that the whole position of demanding a proof is egotistical, which I agree. It is in a sense egotistical. Sure. The seichel in general, the human seichel is egotistical in general. The human seichel needs, that's what we were saying, right? You have God right where you want him. God becomes your puzzle piece, right? He's making your whole logic and your whole world make sense. I agree with you fundamentally. So one second, which sort of brings us into the next thing, which is, okay, so it depends who's asking. So the Rambam says that to say God exists is not really correct, because the term existence applies to everything else. God is totally different. Why would you assume that something which is totally different falls under the same term, right? We actually have in God someone who is totally different from everything else. And since all languages works through category and metaphor, right? Since all language is, this is black and then something else is black and something else is black, and we can look at the three things and see what they have in common, which is this color, right? With God, he doesn't have in common with everything else. He's a totally different type of being. Everything else is on one side because it's dependent, and he's on another side, he's independent, right? So really about God, you can't even say that he exists. Now, the extent to which this fits into the Rambam's philosophy is questionable, because here's the problem. The problem is that if you say that God is totally different, then he doesn't solve your puzzle anymore, right? If God is truly totally different, right, then what you are left with is no explanation of where everything came from, right? Think for a second, think. The whole reason, so on the one hand, philosophically, you have to say God exists, because if God doesn't exist, where does everything else come from? How does everything else exist? How are all of these dependent things, right, standing up? How do they all persist? They must be an independent thing that underlies the whole series of dependent things, right? So that's why God must exist. Now the Rambam is coming and saying, okay, but you can't really say that he exists, right? But at the end of the day, even if we don't say that he exists, even if we realize that he's not under the definition of existence, sof, the Rambam would have to admit, as a philosopher, right, as Chokre Yisrael, which philosophy is not even maybe the right translation. That's a different discussion for a different time. The correct term in Torah is he's a Chokre, right? In modern Hebrew, you would translate as an investigator, right, or philosopher, right? Chokre Yisrael. So as a choker, as an investigator, which means that you're looking at things and trying to make the intellectual puzzle fit, right? God has to exist at the end of the day, because if not, you're left with an empty and broken puzzle, right? So you can say he exists, but he doesn't really exist because he's not like anything else. Sof, right? As the Chassidim say, tachlis and tish, right? Behind up on the table, right? Bottom line, tachlis, right? Tachlis, bottom line. It's funny that you use the word tachlis. It's almost like a pun, because whatever. Never mind. Tachlis, bottom line. Where does all the existence come from? Where does all of the on what do all of the dependent things rely if it doesn't if God doesn't exist? You can't give philosophically, again, philosophical rule. Philosophically, you can't give what you don't have. Right? How can God give something existence if he doesn't have existence, right? It's like you have an empty basket and you pull an apple out of it, right? It's empty. It's empty. If God is not there, if God is a non-Metzius, right? How does Metzius come out of him? How does being come out of him? So no matter how high you go as a philosopher, and you want to say God doesn't really exist because he doesn't fit in the same category, and we call him Metzius, Bilti Metzius Nimtza. He's a Metzius without an existing. He's an existence without an existing existence, right? No matter how far you go, at the end of the day, you need something to fit. You need something to explain your puzzle. That's what your job, right? That was a choice you made when you chose to look at the world philosophically. When I decided that the most important thing to me was making the puzzle fit, I placed inherent limits on what God can be. That's the point, right? God, at the end of the day, has to exist, right? In Kabbalah, we have no such limitations, right? In Kabbalah, when we're not starting with the framework that the puzzle has to fit together, but rather we're starting with the framework that what the Torah given to us at Mount Sinai is true. And that's the most important thing, right? That's what the word Kabbalah means. Received wisdom is the definition of Kabbalah, right? The received wisdom is the most important thing. That's the bottom line. And whether I can make everything fit and explain the world around me is a secondary issue. It would be nice, but it's not the bottom. That's not what's most important, right? If what's most important is the received wisdom, is the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, is the religion of Judaism, is the revelation of God on Mount Sinai, right? If that's what you start with, all of a sudden your understanding of God has a lot more room to maneuver. Because it's not a load-bearing question. It's not a question that holds up the whole building, right? It's not that if I say God doesn't exist, everything comes tumbling down. On the contrary, where's the word existence coming from, right? What does the Torah say? That's what matters to me, right? You need this word exist like everything else exists, and to fit the puzzle together, right? That's not important, right? What's important is what the Torah says, what's the truth that's revealed to us, right? Which brings us to a very interesting thing. In Judaism, and this is going to bring us back to our mimer just in time for the class to end. In Judaism, we have a concept that Jews have believed with faith all the way going back to Mount Sinai, maybe even before, called Bria Yesh Ma'ayin, which means creating something from nothing. Now, until now in this class, we've been focusing on the process aspect of God's creation. We've been saying God doesn't create something from nothing, but with a process, right? But we always added the caveat in our previous classes that there's also a something from nothing aspect. Really, it's both. There's a process, and that process works with an aspect of something from nothing. There's gaps in the process that are like something from nothing gaps, which is a concept we'll discuss much more as we go forward, right? So there's a concept in Yiddishkeit, in Torah, right? Setting aside the puzzle, right? We have a concept in Torah called Bria Yesh Ma'ayin, which means creating something from nothing, right? Something from nothing means what the words mean. It doesn't sound like it. So you have to unpack what the words mean. And Chassidus spends a lot of time unpacking what this concept really means, something from nothing. Something from nothing means that there's nothing in the basket, and then you pull an apple out of it. Right? The very principle that philosophically is impossible, right? The very thing that as a cheker, as to make a puzzle fit, right? It cannot be, is logically impossible, right? It's logically impossible to give something that you don't have, right? Yesh ma'ayin, Bria yesh ma'ayin, creation something from nothing, is giving something that you don't have. That's what Bria Yesh Ma'ayin is. A different way of saying it is it's creating without a process. A different way of saying it is that it's a creation from only one cause rather than multiple causes coming together. All of this we're going to discuss in the coming week, starting next week, God willing. There's different ways there's different words you can use. It all means the same concept, right? Which is that God can create something without being the cause for it. I'm going to say it again. God can create something without being the cause for it. Right? Now the word cause is a very imprecise word in English, so it doesn't really, what I'm saying now is it can only lead to confusion, so it's probably the wrong thing to say, because we're going to have to explain what we mean by this. But the point is going to be like this. The point is going to be like this. And this is what we're going to start explaining from next week. In a paradigm, if you look at the creation, not from the bottom up, trying to fit a puzzle together with your intellect, right? But from the top down, with the concept of Bria Yesh Ma'ayin, of creating something from nothing, right? What you will realize, and this is what the Rebbe is going to explain to us in the coming weeks, what you will realize is that the things that are created, when they're created something from nothing, right, are not really separate things. They don't actually become something. There is no point at which something that is created something from nothing can actually become an independent something. In other words, everything that is created something from nothing constantly depends on its source, is dependent always at every moment, as Eyal referenced earlier, is dependent always in every moment on its source. How can you say something from nothing? I thought it was from nothing, so what's the source, right? That's why we're going to need some more time to unpack all of this. This creation, something from nothing, is not a simple concept. Something that is created, I'm just giving you the summary of what we're going to discuss in the coming weeks. Something that is created, something from nothing, is constantly dependent on its source. Something that is constantly dependent on its source is not really a thing at all, aside from its source. All that is really here is its source. Which means that everything that's created something from nothing, which are all of the creations are not in a state of independent being. They're in a state of bittul, they're in a state of dependence, profound dependence, right? They're in a state of nullification, in fact, of lacking any being of their own. And in fact, the existence of every creation is dependent on the fact that it's batul. Everything in our reality only exists because it is nullified. Everything around us, if it could actually exist, it wouldn't exist. It's only because it doesn't exist that it exists. In other words, the only reason this chair is here right now is because the only thing that's here right now is godliness.
But you need to be, there's a written to that.
1 second.
You need to be in the written with that.
Well, we're going to explain it. That's what we're going to do. We're going to try and come to terms with this. But if there was actually a chair here that was not just an expression of godliness, there would be no chair here. The only way this chair can be here is if there's nothing more to it than an expression of godliness. So what comes out is like this, and with this I'll end. We'll leave this riddle for homework, right? It's actually only because God doesn't exist that the entire creation is totally dependent on Him and nullified to Him. It's only because God doesn't exist, so to speak, that nothing else exists either. All right? It's only because God doesn't exist, as we've explained tonight. If God has to exist, right, then the God we are describing is bound by the laws of logic. So then there can be no creation, something from nothing, which means that nothing else will be nullified, right? But if God is not limited to the laws of logic, if God is not limited to fitting into our puzzle, then He can create something from nothing, which means that what He creates is dependent on Him at every moment, which means that it's never really separate from the word of Hashem, which means that all that's here is godliness. So it's only because God doesn't exist right? That everything around us is godliness.
It's beyond existence. I mean, do not say that it doesn't exist.
I prefer saying it doesn't exist. It's a better headline. L'chaim. But he doesn't exist. He doesn't exist. If you look at the list of all things that exist, God is not on it. By what definition of existence does God exist?
Because we say that because we are out of it. Because the moment that he put it in the basket and we are inside the basket,
Yeah.
and we have the entire thing rotating, in the moment that you are not inside that rhythm, and you fuse out from that thing, then you're out of rhythm. The moment that you're out of rhythm, you don't understand the creation. And that's our problem. That's our problem.
I like the way
What can we say? The Rebbe is going to help us try to fix our problems. Yes. What can I say to you?
Rambam was dealing with that.